All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. We have an incredible group of people who are on the call. We have, close to 100 people who have joined us today, and more coming in. Um, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today for Climate Collateral, exposing the role of militarism in the climate crisis. My name is Johanna Bozo, and I'm the executive director of the Climate and Community Project. And we are one of the co-hosts of this event alongside some of our key partners in the space, including Commonwealth, Transnational Institute, and Win Without War. And we're here on the eve of COP28 climate talks starting in Dubai to talk about the role of the military and its surrounding industry on the climate crisis, a topic largely left off the negotiating table in climate negotiations. This discussion is grounded in two recent reports put out by our co-hosts, Less War, Less Warming, a reparative approach to the US and UK military ecological damages, and Climate Crossfire, how NATO's 2% military spending targets contribute to climate breakdown. Today will be moderated by the incredible Darna Noor, who is a Guardian journalist. Darna is truly incredible, and she's covered some of the most critical issues on the climate crisis, including her coverage of Less War, Less Warming, a report that came out. She also was previously a staff writer at the Boston Globe, Earther, and the Real News Network. And I deeply admire the work that Darna has done on everything from looking at the oil and gas industry, the rise of the Green New Deal, and the future of the green transition. So I'm going to hand it over to one of my favorite climate journalists, Darna Noor, to moderate this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction, Johanna. I'm really excited to be here today to, again, cover a topic that I think that, we in journalism, that many folks who I've spoken to in climate advocacy, who many folks in the sort of foreign policy advocacy world, really sometimes aren't speaking to each other about. And I hope that we can begin to change that today. As Johanna mentioned, while nations across the world have negotiated around reducing greenhouse gas emissions for many sectors, whether that's energy or transit, or even trade, one of the highest emitting sectors has actually remained more or less untouched by all of that policy ambition, and that is emissions from military operations and related industries. And that's not an accident. Powerful governments, powerful negotiators have consistently blocked even assessments of the environmental and climate destruction wrought by sprawling military operations and by toxic manufacturing, let alone actually attempting to reduce that impact. Meanwhile, these high-profile conflicts, wars, geostrategic rivalry, the impacts of the climate crisis themselves signal an era of rapidly escalating danger to communities around the world, increasing the vulnerability to the climate crisis and increased by vulnerability to the climate crisis. And so I'm really excited today to hear from the authors of two new reports that critically analyze the intersection of militarism and the climate crisis and ecological crises. First, we'll hear about the Transnational Institute's Climate Crossfire, how NATO's 2% military spending targets contribute to climate breakdown. And then we'll hear from Climate and Community Project and Commonwealth's Less War, Less Warming report, a reparative approach to the US and UK military ecological damages. Also very excited to hear some important context from an activist working on the intersection of the climate crisis and militarism from a place that's really on the front line of both of those issues. So without further ado, I'll introduce our esteemed panel. I'll begin with our folks who will be speaking about TNI's new report. And first we have Deborah Burton. Deborah Burton is the co-founder of Tipping Point North South, which is a UK-based nonprofit that's campaigned on global issues like economic, trade, tax justice. But since 2018, really its primary policy and advocacy project has been Transform Defense for Sustainable Human Safety, which is exactly what it sounds like, working to put human safety at the heart of defense and security, including by taking on military emissions and boosting climate finance. Deborah previously worked in film, and she was an executive producer on two Tipping Point North South documentaries, We Are Many, which is about the anti-war movement against the war in Iraq, and Open Bethlehem, which is about the impact of Israeli separation walls on Bethlehem. Also speaking about this report is Nick Buxton, who is the Knowledge Hub Coordinator for TNI, which is an international research and advocacy institute committed to building a just democratic planet. At TNI, Nick focuses on issues like digitalization, border politics, the climate crisis, militarism, and he was also co-editor of the really influential book, The Secure and Dispossessed: How the Military and Corporations Are Seeking to Shape a Climate Change World, which I would highly recommend. We'll next hear about our new report from Commonwealth and CCP, first from Kem Regali, who is a senior researcher at Commonwealth, which is a UK-based think tank that works towards a democratic and sustainable economy with a focus on public ownership. At Commonwealth, Kem leads the program of research on the military industry, which aims to develop plans in collaboration with arms workers, a real just transition, to use public ownership to convert industrial capacity within the arms sector to green industries, which we'll hear more about today. He was previously at the climate change think tank E3G, and before that was at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We'll also hear from Patrick Bigger, the research director at the Climate and Community Project, whose research spans topics from market-based climate and biodiversity policy to US public lands management to sovereign debt in the climate crisis, along with long-running research into the role of US military industrial complex and the climate crisis. Before coming to CCP, he was a lecturer in economic geography at Lancaster University in the UK, and his work with Benjamin Neimark on the US Navy's biofuels program was the winner of a prestigious 2019 research award in political geography. And last but not least, today we will hear from Mitzi Joel Tan, who is a full-time climate justice activist with Youth Advocates for Climate Action in the Philippines and Friday for Future for the most affected people and areas in one of the most climate impacted countries on Earth. Mitzi is guided by the principles of joy, anti-imperialism, anti-colonization, and collective action. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us today. Deborah and Nick, I'll start with you. If you can tell us a bit about your new report for TNI.
Okay, so let me just get this up. This is a bit slow to load, this Microsoft. Hold on.
Yeah.
So there we go. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everybody, for inviting us to be part of this. I'm going to do a very quick intro to the military emissions and spending component of this report, Climate Crossfire. It's been released in advance of COP, as Dana says, in Dubai, and is a sort of companion piece to a report we did last year called Climate Collateral. And Climate Collateral was looking at generally military spending and how it accelerates climate breakdown. Climate Crossfire is looking at the implications for both greenhouse gas emissions and military spending if all NATO members meet their 2% of GDP target on military spending. So next one, Nick. So there's really just one number you need to remember when we kind of kick off on this, and this is on emissions, and it is that the global military and its supply chain, so that's the defense sector, is one of the world's biggest polluters. It's estimated on patchy data to be responsible for at least 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if the global military were a country, it would rank 4th, with emissions exceeding Russia's. And the other thing you need to know is this does not include conflict-related emissions. This is not Iraq, it's not Yemen, it's not Gaza, it's not Ukraine. Thanks, Nick. Spending, so the counterpart to this is military spending. Global military spending is now at $2.2 trillion per year. Half of that is NATO's 31 member states. In the past 10 years, since 2013, it's increased by 21%. That will only increase, of course, with Ukraine and Gaza. And the other thing really that's important in all of this is to know that military spending positively correlates to military emissions. So that means the more you spend on these big ticket fossil fuel intensive weaponry, whether in production, so supply chain, or in use, the more you spend, the more you emit. Thanks, Nick. So where would NATO be if it were ranked as a country? It would be ranked as the 40th biggest carbon polluter. So there you have it. The UK comes in at 21, France at 27, NATO at the 40th. If NATO members were to meet that 2% target between 2021 and 2028, their collective carbon footprint would be 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. And that again is greater than the annual emissions of Russia, which is a major oil-producing country. So it's significant. Okay, thanks, Nick. And what will this 2% military spending goal cost us? So again, 2021 to 2028, this is based on a minimum 2% of GDP. Some countries spend more. Many countries are spending less, but more countries are looking to meet this 2% of GDP target. Total expenditure in total, if the target was met over that 8-year period, would be just shy of $12 trillion. The additional expenditure we would need to get to that from where we are now to where we would be over an 8-year period if everybody met that target is $2.57 trillion extra. I mean, that's a big number. So the question is, what would that pay for? Thanks, Nick. Okay, here we go. So there you have it. On the left-hand side, military spending over that period up to 2028. Let's call it 12 trillion. And this is really just to give you a context of numbers and where our values lie and where these priorities are lying. $12 trillion on the military. So you would get 118 years of that Paris commitment for $100 billion of climate finance for developing countries. You get 42 years of African countries' costs for climate adaptation and mitigation. 34 years climate adaptation costs for low and middle income countries. I mean, these numbers give you some sense of where these big military spending governments, the richer governments, where their priorities are lying. Thanks, Nick. Yes, and where's the 100 billion? So this is the 100 billion climate finance target, which is, I think they are planning on meeting it for COP this year, but since 2015, this $100 billion annual has not been met. Meanwhile, since 2015, you can see that graph rising. We've gone from 1.7 trillion, which was already a lot in 2015. We're now at $2.24 trillion. So we would say, where is the climate finance sitting? It's sitting inside money that is actually going into the military. You know, when they say there's no money there, there is absolutely money there. Thanks, Nick. So just to put all of this in a geopolitical context, and, you know, what are our adversaries doing? Russia, China, what are they spending? That slide there is for a 2-year period, 2021, 2022. Now, in 2022, NATO spent more than 13 times as much as Russia and its allies. So this collective security treaty organization that Russia has includes Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So they, plus Russia, they were outspent to the tune of 13 times by NATO. China, NATO spent 3 times more in 2021, 3 times more than Russia and its allies and China combined. So, you know, again, we would say, why this need to be talking about reaching 2% of GDP? We're already outspending all those that NATO would consider its adversaries. Thanks, Nick. I mean, you know, we have to talk about Israel, of course, in all of this. So, I mean, what we're witnessing is a sort of, you know, most extreme example of a David and Goliath scenario in terms of Israel's war on Gaza. So in 2020, Israel was the world's 12th largest exporter of arms. But what's really interesting is those numbers just next door, because relative to its size, Israel is the world's #1 arms dealer. Weapons make up to 25% of Israel's industrial exports. I mean, Israel is the 15th largest military spender in the world. I think I've read somewhere that it aspires, I would need to check this, but I think it aspires to being in the top 10. And it's spending $24 billion a year on its military. So we can see how this plays out, and have been before our very eyes on our TV screens. So there you have a highly armed nation absolutely letting rip on a population that was before totally aid dependent, described as an open-air prison camp and not in control of basic services like water, power. So I'm sure we'll come on to that later. That's it. I'm going to hand over to Nick now. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks. I'm having some tech gremlins have attacked me, so I've lost suddenly all the slides. So I'm just going to open up another slide thing and see if that works. Okay, it looks like it does. So one of the things that Deborah's obviously talked about, kind of military emissions and also military spending. I want to talk to a little bit about adaptation, because one of the big issues about increasing military spending is that it will shape how we adapt to the climate crisis. And what we're witnessing as we have this increase in military spending is a militarized response to crises, which are increasingly where climate change is a factor. And what it's doing is it's taking us in the opposite direction of a just transition towards a more militarized adaptation. So all of these things don't just affect mitigation, they also affect how we will adapt to climate change. And one of the ways that we can see that starting to happen very clearly is the way that arms exports by the richest countries are going to the climate vulnerable countries. So those Annex II countries, Annex II is a grouping within the UN climate negotiations. It's basically the richest countries. They're the ones who've made that commitment to provide 100 billion, what hasn't been met yet, to the poorest countries by 2020 every year, and they're not doing that. What they are doing is providing weapons. We did an analysis of which were to the most climate vulnerable countries, designated by a group called NDA GAIN. We looked then at who was getting exports from these richest countries, and all 40 of the climate most vulnerable countries were receiving exports of arms. These are often going to authoritarian regimes, or they're going to conflict zones. So they're fueling a crisis which is coming on top of a deep climate crisis. So they're actually making the potential for communities to adapt to climate change far worse. The other way that we can see this playing out is, as this military spending is going, climate change is now being described as a security threat increasingly. And so we've seen a whole ream of climate strategies by the military and national intelligence agencies of the major powers, all framing climate change as a threat that will pose a threat to national security. And when you look at what they're talking about the threat to the operations of their military, to the installations of the military, for example, sea bases that could get flooded. But they're also talking about poor countries coping with climate change becoming a threat to the north. And the way that we see that play out so most strongly, and you see it in all the national security strategies, is around the issue of migration. You can see on the left here a quote from the UK National Security Strategy saying that more frequent extreme political instability and conflict and migration will become more likely. And in light of these pressures, it'll be vital that we strengthen our ability to control migration. And so we're already seeing this kind of militarized adaptation playing out with the vast growth of militarized borders, particularly the European Union, as in Australia and the US. And it's often exactly the same arms firms who provide some of the weapons that are going for arms sales, who are also winning the contracts to militarize the borders. So as a result of this increased militarized form of adaptation, which comes with military spending, we're seeing that the real winners in this situation are the arms industry. This is just a graph here which shows military stocks, which are at the top in green, and below just the general share prices for global stocks. And you can see that militaries consistently mirrors, but consistently outpaces other sectors. And below that, you can see some of the key firms which are both winning military contracts, but also winning these increasingly these security response contracts, such as borders for the climate crisis. So I just want to conclude, but basically what we're saying and what our research is showing is that increase in military spending causes climate change due to the increased emissions. It diverts resources needed for climate action and just transition. It expands the arms trade and increases, therefore, the vulnerability of frontline communities who are most impacted by climate change. And it makes a just transition, which is what we so urgently need, much less likely. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for that really comprehensive introduction. Looking forward to hearing a bit more about that report a little later. But first, I'd love to throw it over to Kem and Patrick from Commonwealth and Climate and Community Project, respectively. Again, their new report is Less War, Less Warming. So I'll throw it over to the two of you to teach us a little bit about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Darna, and thanks to Nick and Deborah for presenting their great report. One little piece of housekeeping before I get started. Please feel free to drop any questions in the chat and we will circle back to them afterwards. I don't think we're going to take, vocalized questions. So just be aware that that is the way to proceed. So my name is Patrick. I'm here with my co-author, Kim Rogali. Nick Pierce and Keitiki Zajkar were our co-authors on this report, and we're totally indispensable to creating this. And the premise of our work is pretty straightforward. We looked at the self-reported military emissions from both the US and UK since 2015, and then applied a pretty middle-of-the-road social cost of carbon to those emissions. That's basically the monetary damages caused by each additional ton of CO2 released beyond the sort of maximum that we have within to stay within our budget before we overshoot the 2-degree target. And combined, we found that these emissions, quote unquote, cost $111 billion between 2015 and 2022. And we would say that this is a very conservative estimate, since each military failed to report emissions at least 1 year during that period. Each military's carbon accounting procedures leave a lot to be desired. And we very easily and justifiably could have picked a much higher social cost of carbon than the roughly $300 a ton that we went with. Nonetheless, this figure gives us an indication of the climate costs of running world-spanning military operations while demonstrating the severe discrepancy between each country's spending on climate action, as well as even more severe disconnect between each country's paltry contributions to international climate finance relative to both military spending and, more broadly, their cumulative contribution to aggregate emissions in the climate crisis. I won't belabor this point too much, since we heard about the overarching roles of NATO militaries in the climate crisis from Deborah and Nick, but I do think it's worth underscoring how carbon intensive the US and UK militaries are. So during World War I, the average US soldier consumed about a gallon of oil a day. That figure is now north of 20. And those emissions stack up. The US military constitutes about 80% of all federal government emissions. And while UK military spending and emissions are an order of magnitude lower than those of the US, we do have better data on the carbon intensity of the UK arms industry, which helps us get a clearer picture of the climate harms produced by the wider military industrial complex, in addition to the acute suffering they produce when those weapons are, for example, gifted to Israel to massacre Palestinian civilians. One of the key things to remember when we're thinking about US and UK military emissions is that even though emissions certainly rise during large-scale operations, everyday operations form the bulk of each military's emissions. And there's two key dimensions to that. First is the sprawling network of bases that the US and UK operate around the world, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of around 850 installations combined, although nobody really knows the exact figure. We draw from David Vine's superlative work on Base World for this figure. But keeping all these imperial outposts staffed and provisioned creates massive sprawling logistical networks for materiel, food, construction materials, and above all, fossil fuels. As General David Petraeus said in 2011, energy is the lifeblood of our warfighting capabilities. So just energy is central to everything that these militaries do, especially in the form of liquid fuels. And then the other major dimension here is the energetic requirements of the major weapon systems that these militaries operate. Tanks, ships, and above all, jets are prodigious consumers of oil, and that intensity is rising. For example, the F-35, pictured here refueling, consumes almost 40% more fuel than the F-16 that it largely replaced. But given the staggering $1.75 trillion cost of the F-35 program, it's unlikely that these jets will be taken out of service anytime soon. And so this is a key example of how these weapon systems lock in fossil fuel use. Our report also reflects on the role the UK and US militaries had in creating the global fossil economy. Going all the way back, the transition from coal to oil in the UK and US navies at the turn of the 20th century instantly spawned massive guaranteed demand for oil, and each country's foreign policy shifted to meet that demand. From the UK mandate system in West Asia that secured oil interests for UK and US oil companies, to the construction of bases and refueling stations throughout the Indian and Pacific Oceans, each military has played a significant role in the creation and then protection of the global oil industry. And it's also worth noting that bases and operations around the world often have severe acute environmental impacts beyond the diffuse emissions of greenhouse gases. From forever chemicals and firefighting foams at bases around the world, to toxic burn pits in Afghanistan, to toxic waste in Puerto Rico and other modern US colonies, the everyday operations of the US and UK militaries are harming communities that live adjacent to bases. And that's before we even get into all the social and economic harms that accompany these bases. So that's kind of an overview of the analysis that we do. And I'll turn it over to my co-author, Kim, to reflect on our reparative strategy, basically what is to be done about this state of affairs.
Thanks, Patrick. And I think one thing to reflect on here is kind of that core question of what does a reparative strategy in this context look like? It's not just about remediation and compensation, but also about building a better world out of what we currently have. So at the kind of the first stage of that, and I think as Patrick touched on, we have to recognize that you can't just have a green military, decarbonized military systems. The core of UK and US military systems are things like fighter jets. They don't have alternative fuels that they can use. They don't have zero carbon fuels, and those systems are locked in for many decades. So what we need is less military operations, fewer military bases, and a scaling back of the capacity that we have right now. We need to pay countries for past and present pollution. So that's recognizing the social costs that we outline in our report of the US and UK military activity, and paying international climate finance that's long been neglected to the countries that are least responsible for climate crisis. The Global Military Super Fund is really expanding out an environmental protection agency policy that already exists for environmental remediation within the United States. We're arguing that that needs to be global and applied to the network of overseas US military bases, and a similar fund needs to be introduced by the UK. There's also the issue of data, which has been touched on, and we can talk about more in the questions. But really what I want to speak to most is this idea of a just transition. Because when you have a military industrial complex that is this well funded and this significant, that also creates political constituencies that depend on the military industry and the military for their employment. And if we're going to be scaling back military operations and military industries, we need to have strategies in place that can really kind of create new political constituencies that support the change. Onto the next slide. So what you see here is mentioned earlier, the F-35 fighter jet, a $1.7 trillion program. And I think what this image illustrates a little bit of, this is just a kind of the very few components that are mentioned in this image, but you can see some of the manufacturing locations involved. And the key thing to know with the F-35 program is that within the United States, its supply chain can be traced to almost every state in the US. So what you're doing through that kind of scale of military spending, that $1.7 trillion, is both nationally and internationally building a political constituency that can support that kind of high military spending. And that was a kind of US government strategy throughout the Cold War period, that they would use military spending partly even to compensate for a lack of social infrastructure and social security, and that would underpin a coalition of arms workers, local communities, military industrial companies, all that supported greater defence spending. So if we're looking at scaling back operations, at scaling back the military industry, we need to think about how to address this political reality, which we can see a bit of on the next slide. So in this image, you can see some of the workers at Lucas Aerospace in the UK in the 1970s, who, when they're facing layoffs at their company, which made aerospace components for the defence sector, they put forward an alternative plan, an alternative vision for their company to make different goods. They called them socially useful goods, and it even included green goods like heat pumps for clean heating of homes. And that's been a real tradition within the labour movement in the US and the UK. You had in the early 80s in the US, the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers supporting conversion bills at Congress. You had in the UK, Barrow and Furness, you had oceans of work proposals to convert production to renewables. And more recently in the UK and US, there's been a study from the University of Glasgow, which was actually put by Nico in the chat earlier, that basically showed that some workers do still support this kind of action, although there are big divisions. And I think a core theme is that public investment planning and coordination would all be essential if this was going to be a realistic policy. What we can see on the next slide is some more recent activity. So this is an image from St. Charles, Missouri, a Boeing plant that makes precision guidance kits for bombs that the Israeli military has been using in its genocidal bombardment of Gaza. And this is in response to a call from Palestinian trade unions to basically support an arms embargo and block the transfer of arms and military goods to Israel since this most recent part of the war has been ongoing. In this image, you might be able to kind of gather from it, you know, more as activist action rather than action from the workers themselves, although there have been some fantastic supportive actions from workers across the world in both the arms and logistics sectors. So what we can see is maybe the start of something bigger, that, you know, deeper work will be needed to build support from within the arms industry, but there is that long history to build on, and things like supporting an arms embargo or supporting conversion can become realistic possibilities. Onto the final slide now. And this is kind of one example of how this isn't just something that workers have talked about, that activists have talked about, but you can see in this in this photo from the BAE Systems website, a hybrid bus that Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems both played a role in developing in the 1990s onwards, and it's currently that system is now used across the world. Obviously, arms companies like Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems, they operate in the interests of their shareholders, and also their customers, which are states, and they exist to produce weapons. But they hold within them a sort of technological and industrial capacity that if you were to convert production to redirect it or repurpose it to other means using public ownership, could be used to create different goods. So that capacity for a just transition, to use that capacity that we have within the military industrial sector to make different types of goods can be used. It was something that happened in the UK during COVID. You saw arms companies making ventilators and things like that. And that shouldn't be a surprise given the amount of subsidy that they receive from our governments across the world. And that's something that we believe we need to push towards.
Thank you so much, Patrick and Kem. Really, really important work here, and especially, I think, useful to sort of take in concert with the new TNI report. For a little bit more context, I'll now throw it over to Mitzi, who, again, is a full-time climate justice advocate or an activist with Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines and Fridays for Future, Most Affected People and Areas. Mitzi, please tell us a little bit more about how we can work to dismantle the ecological and militarization effects of the military-industrial complex globally.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all the reports that have been said so far. I think these numbers and these studies really just concretize and really drill in the facts within all of us, with civil society that has been saying for decades now, from the marginalized peoples, that military has no role in climate justice, right? That the militarization happening in communities is making things worse. As a very concrete example, the Philippines used to have two active US military bases, and what we've seen because of that is that they disposed a lot of hazardous waste in these bases, like solvent, pesticide, lead, mercury, and other heavy metals, and this contaminated the land, the water, the air, and the communities closest to these existing US bases had a higher chance of leukemia, cancer, kidney diseases, respiratory problems, especially for young people and elderly people. And now we're seeing that there's at least 4 to 5 that we know of new US bases to be put up here in the Philippines. And that's just here in the Philippines. And across the world, this is happening. Like, militarization continues to expand in the midst of the climate crisis. And it's not just the emissions that we have to be worried about, that everyone's already talked about. And it's not just about the financing that's going into the military instead of the crucial climate adaptation measures. It's also how the military, they are training, like, for example, the US military, the military of Israel has trained Philippine military on how counterterrorism looks like. And what does that look like? That means my country, in the Philippines, is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for environmental defenders and activists. That means that people, indigenous people, small peasants, small farmers, small fisher folk who are going up against corporate interests are now being militarized and harassed and displaced from their communities. And that is what counterterrorism looks like, because that's how military training looks like. Like, they actually call these environmental defenders who are on the front line of environmental defense terrorists. Just recently, I think like 2 months ago, 2 young activists were abducted by the military, and then they were forced to sign a statement saying that they were actually rebel surrenderies. And they had to sign this in the middle of a military camp. So of course they signed it. And then when they were put on a press conference by the military and they said the truth, we're not rebel surrenderies. We were abducted by these military. And the military, they tried to shut down the press conference immediately, but it was live, and so they were able to go out. But now they're facing cases of perjury, and they're saying that they're lying to everyone in the court. And all that they did was fight against these reclamation projects, these projects that were destroying the ocean and the lives of coastal communities here in the Philippines. And so that's the concrete connection of not just the military with emissions and the climate finance that's going into the military, but the human rights violations, especially the environmental defenders, who in the time of this environmental crisis and environmental and planetary emergency, we should be listening to the most. And yet instead, they are the ones being most harassed and being most threatened, because the military, they are also, what they do is they protect state and corporates, right? Because what they do is they're trying to protect the profit of the few, of the ones in power. And so someone has mentioned it already earlier before, what's happening in Palestine, but I really just want to drill in the issue that it really is a climate issue. A lot of people ask me, like, Mitzi, as a climate justice activist, why are you talking so much about all these issues around peace and unrest when you should be focusing on climate action? And I'm like, how are you going to do climate action when the military, not just the US military, but the militaries across the world, are some of the biggest polluters and sources of carbon dioxide emissions? And knowing fully well that the people who are exposed to war and systemic violence are more vulnerable to the climate crisis. Even the IPCC reports, or the UN climate body of scientists, clearly stated in their last report that colonization is a reason behind the vulnerability of countries and communities to the climate crisis. And that's what's happening in Palestine, settler colonization. That's what's happening in Kurdistan, in West Papua, in Sudan, in Congo, across the world, where communities are being encroached upon by the military. That's what's happening. And so we cannot take climate justice and climate action outside of the conversation of militarization and of peace, because you cannot have climate justice without the end of these militarizations, the end of these harassments. And that's why this coming COP28, or the UN Climate Summit, in like a few days, where the global stocktake is going to be talked about, where basically countries have to contribute report their national determined contributions, or how much emissions emissions they have right now, we have to make sure that there's a push that military emissions are actually also accounted for, because right now it's only voluntary, it's only optional. And so countries can say all that they want about their targets, emissions targets, although again, it's not that great anyway. But then they can keep polluting in the military side, and we'll still be on that track to 2 degrees Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius, because the climate crisis cannot be talked about without without talking about the demilitarization movement. And so we need that extra boundary to ensure that we limit and lessen the military processes, just as was mentioned earlier already. And if that's not enough to really see the connection of both, I don't know what else is needed, because really climate justice is really just about the fight for life. It's not about lowering emissions, right? It's not just about the carbon dioxide emissions or the parts per million particles. It's about life. It's about people who are impacted by the crisis, and the crises happening everywhere. And so to fight for life is to fight for human rights, and to fight for human rights is to fight against all the militarization that's happening across the world.
So beautifully said. Thank you so much, Mitzi, for all of this. I'm really excited to get into some questions with our panelists, but to all in the audience, really excited to hear from you as well. So again, just to echo Patrick, if you've got questions, please drop them in the chat and I will pose them to our esteemed panel here. Deborah and Nick, I want to start by asking a bit more about your new report for TNI, and asking a bit about what NATO's approach should be. Because, you know, NATO says it's improving its energy efficiency, increasing climate disaster relief support. It even says that it will zero out its emissions by 2050. But your report, as well as the new work from Climate and Community and Commonwealth, makes it clear that simply cutting emissions or greening the military is not a solution. So what do you make of these actions and these commitments? And what should NATO's role be in the push to solve the climate crisis, if it should have one at all?
Well, NATO as an organization can say and do what it says it wants to do in terms of energy efficiency, because it's a bit like the UN. I mean, you know, the real action is what what is the behavior of your membership. So NATO head office can definitely say, yes, we will, cut back on this and that. I mean, and even, when it was out there saying that, it was making that distinction clear. It was referring to its own assets, NATO's own assets, which includes surveillance planes and drones, but it's their headquarters, it's the back office, it's the estate, you could say, the buildings. At the same time, NATO was saying, this is just recently, it will also seek to help its allies in reducing their national military carbon footprint. So the devil is a little bit in the detail there. It's then back to countries. So yes, it is involved in disaster relief stuff, like as armies were, militaries were, I should say, during the pandemic. But we're still back to this fundamental question, which is they can talk about cutting and they can talk about 2050. But they're asking 2%, they're asking for every member country to be spending 2% of GDP. Only, I think, is it 6? I'm not sure. 6 to 11 countries have signed up to are spending at that 2% of GDP level. There's still many more countries that they're pushing to spend more on. That is absolutely flying in the face of climate targets. And given that emissions correlates to spending and military spending is increasing and we are at war, in all sorts of places, it's what is it? Is it kind of military greenwash? They can spin it the way they like, but the bottom line is they cannot in our lifetimes go green. As Ken was saying, no jet, no warship, no tank, no bomb, no missile can be out there without fossil fuel. And I think we need to look at it the other way. We need to be thinking, okay, in the way that, the economy, we need to be talking about degrowth. We need to be asking different questions about our defense needs as humanity. And are we actually protected from the things we are at most risk?
I think Deborah summed it up very well, but I just want to add one thing, which is, whenever you hear 2050 or net zero, you can be sure that basically it's a commitment to do nothing. And that's why they're saying 2050, because all the climate science says that and in fact, the IPCC says that we have till 2030 to reduce emissions by 43%. So if you replace an F-16 jet with a jet of F-35, which uses about 40% more fuel, and that jet's in operation for usually 30 to 40 years, you're locking in emissions for years to come. So it's really just a nonsense, and it's because they can't address the key issue, which is that most 70% of emissions comes from fuel use, and there isn't an electric plane, there isn't an alternative. And when they talk about sustainable fuel, they're talking about usually biofuels, which would use huge amounts of land, which would cause food security problems. So all the things point to the fact that they just don't have solutions. And the real solution is that we need to be cutting back the military and investing that money in what is really safety and security for everyone, which is not built. I saw it in relationship to Israel and Palestine, a very powerful essay that says safety is ultimately relational. It's about how we build better relations. But you can't get it but through bombing innocent civilians. That won't give you safety or security. What will give you security and safety is building relationships with people of justice and peace.
Thank you so much for that. And speaking of building those relationships, Kem, I want to turn to you and Patrick, because you mentioned that workers right now are actually taking action at arms production plants as a response to a call from Palestinian unions for an arms embargo to Israel. Could you talk a little bit about how that could pave the way for more worker-led action, promoting arms conversion, and how that could actually benefit our climate goals as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the action that's been taken so far, I don't want to overstate or understate the level of worker involvement in it. So you can see quite specifically in the UK, there have been various blockades of arms factories actually that are part of the supply chain for the F-35 fighter jet because it's exported to Israel. And those have been undertaken by trade unionists, but they're not always by the trade unionists who are part of the unions that organise in those factories, or workers themselves who work in those factories. But what they are doing is building for the long term by trying to leaflet the workers who do work there, trying to engage in political education and sort of build the institutions necessary so that you could have workers in those factories themselves coming out in support of the arms embargo. In the US, with the Block the Boat initiative, for instance, that was trying to stop a boat carrying military goods to Israel that docked in Oakland and in Tacoma. You do need to get workers who are involved in the logistics sector involved to even undertake those actions in the first place, so that they carry like a level of worker involvement with them. But I think that what we're seeing already can be built on massively, and it's sort of incumbent on these previous movements that existed within trade union movements and the labour movement to try and organise now for the long term, to build on actions that are kind of directly thinking about the arms embargo to Israel, to once hopefully there is a lasting peace in Palestine, to start thinking about the military industry as a whole, and to think about these conversion plans, and to do that sort of deeper work of getting workers who are in those factories and in the relevant logistics sectors on board with source.
Thanks so much. Mitzi, I'd love to turn to you now to talk a little bit about the politics of actually making the kinds of changes that we're talking about here. Because, you know, in the US and the UK, you know, broadly in many powerful countries around the world, support for militaries and for military spending is really kind of unquestioned amongst all parties. But there's evidence now that the Biden administration here in the US is losing favor among young people for both its fossil fuel policies, pro-fossil fuel policies, that is, and for its support for Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. So talk a little bit about the impact of both climate change and militarization on youth, and why, you know, that sort of pro-fossil fuel, pro-militarization strategy might be falling out of favor amongst people of the younger generation as well.
First, we have, of course, like in Palestine, majority of the population are young people, and most of the people who have been killed are children, like actual children. And so that, I think, is one big thing that has really woken up those in the younger generation across the world who may not have been tuned in on this yet. And it's devastating, right? Seeing all these lives. And this is, it might be wrong, but I read somewhere that this is one of the first times in history where we're actually able to watch and tune in quite quite intensely to what's happening on the ground with this violence, because previous violences of this amount, the social media wasn't like this yet, wasn't as developed in this way. And so we're developing a different kind of relationship with the people on the ground. And some people have even compared it to the Hunger Games, where you're actually seeing people being killed and developing these relationships with them, and you're not able to do anything, and you feel like you're not able to do anything because you're so far away. And so that is what we're seeing right now, where young people are feeling that, and feeling that compassion fatigue and frozenness. And so that's why it's also slowly and so important to turn that into action. And it's something that we've seen it with the climate crisis also before. A lot of people have gotten frozen with the anxiety of the climate crisis, and now we're seeing the same effect in people. And so now that's why there's a big push from young people also to ensure that we are pushing these world leaders to change these policies, to stop the support both of fossil fuels and of the war, especially because Biden has promised quite a lot about being a climate president. He's never actually promised that much around like peace, but then more of at least in the climate side and fossil fuels, he did promise a lot when he was running. And so he owes that not just to the people of the US, but across the world, because the US is such a big player in both in the climate crisis and in militarization.
Absolutely. I have so many more questions, but I want to turn it over to audience questions now. One from Stephen Semler, whose work on the intersection of the climate crisis and militarization, I would also recommend. Stephen asks, do you have any thoughts on how the peace, climate, and labor movements can better coordinate and cooperate? Because I would think one kind of theme that's emerging here is that folks across these different sectors are not always sort of coordinating in the way that we all could be. Maybe I'll start with Patrick on this, unless someone else has thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I'll just expand on some of the ideas that I popped in the chat. It's definitely something that we've been thinking about. I've been to a couple of convenings lately of folks working at this intersection of militarism and the climate crisis. And I think that I'm seeing a lot of encouraging signs, especially from peace groups and kind of critical foreign policy think shops, that they're all starting to take the climate crisis more seriously. And I think that's good. I just think that for peace groups, the climate crisis is only an issue that's started now becoming a top line issue. And I argue for the mainstream climate movement, militarism and war is not a top line issue yet. And I think it's just a matter of being willing to go into one another's spaces, showing up for one another, forming relationships, forging solidarity between movements, and really sort of starting to grapple with a total critique of the climate crisis. And, beyond that, militarism has all sorts of extremely pernicious impacts. I mean, I can speak, having lived in both the US and UK, it's especially pronounced in the US, where sort of violence and this sort of fixation on the aesthetics of war, not to mention actual warfare, really permeates everyday life in a way that makes it more difficult for people to relate to one another in a way that is conducive to forging long-term just outcomes in an increasingly dangerous world. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done waking up these movements and really broadening out the critique so that we understand how these issues co-constitute and then really impact every facet of our everyday life and make the world not just more dangerous, but also just more unpleasant when I'm, dodging extremely violent looking trucks on my bicycle, right? I don't think that it's too far stretched to say that it permeates every facet of life in that way. And trying to get that to resonate with folks, I think, is part of the job, although I don't think that gets all the way there. And, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think it's something that we all have to sort of grapple towards a solution together.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from Kim Hunter. Similarly, what groups can we engage to help combat the climate crisis? Kim especially is asking if there are other unions where inroads are being made or have been made. Wondering if any of the rest of you have sort of heard any whisperings of action that might already be brewing.
Happy to jump in with some UK related work. I know that Unite, for instance, which is a trade union in the UK, one of the UK's biggest trade unions, that historically was a supporter of arms conversion, or as they call it, defence diversification, has in recent years shifted away from that position. And there's lots of organising going on within that trade union to try and shift them back towards a position of diversification. And I think it touches on the question that Patrick was answering as well, in the sense that what we're seeing is on the one hand the labour movement needing to come closer to the peace and climate movements, and on the other hand the peace and climate movements needing to have more sort of understanding of trade unions and kind of why they're in the position that they're in. Because in the UK you have and you have initiatives as well trying to get greater support for Palestine and criticism of what the Israeli military is doing at the moment. But actually the leaderships of most of the major trade unions, at least at the start of the conflict, were very quiet, and they've struggled to support the arms embargo that has been called for by their partner trade unions in Palestine. So it's very much sort of early emergent work in the UK. And the other group that I would mention is a group called the New Lucas Plan, who have some members from the original Lucas Plan back in the 70s and are seeking to continue that work.
Absolutely. To speak to what Ted Spencer has dropped in the chat, it seems also that a major barrier here is, actually the barriers to unionization and to organizing in workplaces itself. So another thing, I guess, to keep in mind. I'll wrap up by asking, of course, we're speaking here on the eve of COP28. And as we've all mentioned, despite their massive carbon impact, military emissions aren't really counted in international climate agreements. There's also very little talk of the actual environmental justice effects of militarization itself. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what we could expect to come from COP28, what the best possible outcomes from COP28 could be for, a world that really does take on the climate environmental impacts of war and of militarization, and what we need to be doing after COP28. What can we be doing to support the unions, the communities, the militarized communities that are already working on these issues, and sort of support that work globally as well.
I can start. I know that a lot of civil society, we've been planning to ensure that what's happening in Palestine, but not just in Palestine, but also across the world, really is highlighted at COP, and how it's connected to the climate crisis, especially connecting fossil fuel and war and how they fuel and drive each other. This is really crucial and important so that we can, unfortunately for a lot of the climate movement, outside of the activist space, people don't see militarization and war as like part of the climate crisis. And so I think a big push at COP is getting people to understand the link of it with fossil fuels, and again try our best to push that for now, get military emissions to be actually accounted for in international negotiations as we work towards a world that is demilitarized.
And I think it's also worth saying that this COP, there are 8 sessions on this topic. I mean, that's hugely significant compared with last year. Last year there was, I think there were a couple, and the one that we were involved with was an official side event led by Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. We're talking about this in a way that we were not. And there were researchers doing work on Iraq and the emissions burden of the Iraq war, but of course nobody was talking about that. We are talking about this now at COP because of Ukraine last year, and Gaza will be everywhere at COP. It will have all sorts of ramifications, both as Mitzi says, at the grassroots kind of activist level and at the negotiating level. But I have to say, considering this whole issue really just came out, the first COP was Glasgow just 2 years ago, and that was on the outside. It wasn't even inside the main arena. We now have 8 events addressing military emissions, military spending, militarization, gender and military. There's a whole plethora of events happening. Would you agree, Mitzi? And it is getting on the agenda. We have been having meetings with people at IPCC level to be talking about IPCC reports. We've made submissions to the global stocktake. It's all chipping away at this top end, this technical end, and it's all this noise that we can create collectively. And I think that the researchers and campaigners around the world have done a fantastic job at getting this issue in the spotlight at COP. In an incredibly short space of time, but we all know the clock is ticking. But with the campaigners like Mitzi, we will get there.
On that positive note, amid a world of horror, I want to thank all of you for being here today. Again, we've heard from Deborah Burton and Nick Buxton. We've heard from Patrick Bigger and Kem Rogali, and we've heard from Mitzi Joel-Tan. Thank you all so much for being here, and thanks for having me as well. Highly recommend checking out the reports in full also. I know that the links are in the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Yep, and we will upload the recording of this along with the slides here in the next couple hours, and those will be available hopefully by the end of the day or so. Thank y'all so much for coming, and thanks once again to Darna Noor for being such a fantastic moderator. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we look forward to building with you on these this crucial intersection in the months and years to come.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Solidarity forever.
Thank you.